It was the morning of the 6th of June, 1966. New York was bustling with the constant tread of commuters and people using cross-city transport. Unbeknownst to the public and the authorities, a covert group of US Army scientists were making their way towards various stations along the 7th and 8th Avenue lines of the subway, the most populated and well-frequented system of underground transport in the world. The scientists had separated themselves to avoid detection. Their mission must remain top secret, not just to ensure the experiments went according to plan, but most notably to avoid outright terror in the public they intended to experiment on. Some of the scientists carried small devices, either in boxes or attached to their belts, to be used for sampling the air. The rest of them carried light bulbs. The light bulbs in question were filled with roughly 175 grams of Bacillus subtilis bacteria. That equates to around 87 trillion organisms in each bulb. And their plan, very simply, was to see how quickly and effectively they could spread that bacteria through their own populace, using the train and tunnel network that sprawled under the vast city. They would infect over 1 million people during the coming days, and this represented just only one of at least 239 similar experiments conducted by the American military during a 20-year germ warfare testing program. Following World War II, America sought to secure its pole position in global superiority through advancements in weaponry that would nullify the threat of other nations, essentially weapons you could not fight back against. Now, obviously this primarily took the form of nuclear development, but the US Army was also keenly interested in researching germ warfare, something with potentially even more far-reaching consequences than a nuclear bomb. This had been aided greatly through research traded to America by Japan following World War II. We're going to look at that in great detail in an upcoming video because the details of what occurred there are truly gut-wrenching. But shortly after this, in 1949, America began using a combination of their own research and much of what they had appropriated from Japan to begin testing what they believed to be harmless, yet infective germs on their own population. During the next 2 decades, the US Army would conduct 239 separate open-air tests of biological agents on its own population. The majority of them used inert chemicals to simulate bacteria, but a total of 80 of those experiments used differing live bacteria that the Army believed to be non-harmful. Every bacteria they used is now considered to be a pathogen and responsible for causing at least minor health issues in those infected. We're going to look at a couple of the most notable incidents during these 2 decades of trials, but I just want to make concrete how widespread they were. This was an extended and purposeful experimentation on the American people, and even in some instances, the world where these pathogens were released in airports and picked up in countries even on the other side of the globe. Most importantly, the Army was so keen to keep it a secret because it was directly in breach of the Nuremberg Code, which stipulates that voluntary, informed consent is required for each participant. To this day, the US Army has not been held responsible under the Nuremberg Code. However, a news report emerged during the early 1970s that brought this unlawful and immoral testing into the public eye. Multiple Freedom of Information requests were filed to confirm the validity of the claims, including an unlikely one put forth by the Church of Scientology. It's that rather extensive document published by the US Army and verified by the American government that shed light on the details of 2 decades of illegal experimentation being carried out by the US Army's Special Operations Division out of Fort Detrick, Maryland. Following the release of these documents, scientists that had been involved in the program were called up to testify before Congress. There, the scientists testified that local officials had no knowledge of the tests occurring and admitted to the efficacy of the trials, stating that in the New York experiments, if a stronger pathogen had been used, it would have put New York out of commission. Everything we're going to look at now comes from either documents released by Freedom of Information Act requests, primarily the extensive US Army document I just mentioned, or alternatively from the testimony given by scientists under Congress. I will leave links to these 2 main files in the pinned comment, but I would encourage you to further check sources on everything I've mentioned. For now though, let's look at some of the experiments that made up these 2 decades of unlawful experimentation. Perhaps the most notable early example of ethical boundaries being crossed comes from September of 1950, 1 year into the germ warfare experiments being carried out by the Special Operations Division out of Fort Detrick. This was dubbed Operation Sea Spray, which bears haunting connotations given that the purpose of the experiment was to spray large quantities of bacteria over the San Francisco Bay Area from a ship just offshore, in order to determine how vulnerable a coastal city may be to a bioweapons attack. From the 20th to the 27th of September 1950, the US Navy released 2 differing bacterias from on board their vessel in the bay. Everyone involved believed the bacteria to be harmless to humans. Based on monitoring equipment stationed in 43 separate locations around San Francisco, the US Army were able to determine that the city had received a large enough dose for nearly every single member of its 800,000 strong population to have inhaled at least 5,000 particles. In terms of proving vulnerability to a biological attack, well, the experiment was a resounding success. Unfortunately, but expectedly, on October 11th, 1950, 11 San Francisco residents were admitted to Stanford Hospital, all displaying a very rare form of urinary tract infection. This outbreak was so unusual that doctors at Stanford wrote it up for publication in a medical journal and assumed it must have been caused by something inside the hospital. This was also the reasoning the US Army gave during a 1977 Senate subcommittee on the topic, where they admitted their actions but refused any link to rising illnesses in the area. Of the 11 residents taken ill, 10 made a full recovery, but one patient, Edward J. Nevin, died 3 weeks later. Beyond this, cases of pneumonia in the area increased, which was thought to be linked to one of the bacteria released over the bay, but a causal relation could not be established. Years after the event, medical professionals also suggested that it may have been the cause for an increased number of heart valve infections noticed at the time, as well as an increase in serious infections in intravenous drug users during the following decade. There was no evidence that the US Army had warned local officials or the relevant health authorities before willfully infecting its own people. The same bacteria was used by American and British scientists as late as the 1970s in the United Kingdom during the DICE germ warfare trials in Dorset. Only this time it was mixed with phenol and an anthrax stimulant, because of course it was. Over the years following Operation Sea Spray, many more similar experiments were conducted. During the 1950s, Army researchers would disperse the Serratia bacteria, thought to cause the outbreak of infection during Operation Sea Spray, over the new targets of Panama City and Key West, Florida. They also dispersed zinc cadmium sulfide, a known cancer-causing agent, over Minnesota and other Midwestern states to see how far they would spread in the atmosphere. Particles were detected over 1,000 miles away in New York State. Bacillus globigii, the other bacteria used in Operation Sea Spray, was utilized a great deal more over the next 2 decades, as it was easy to monitor and had no proven links to harm in humans. It is now recognized as a pathogen, causes food poisoning, and can seriously hurt people with a weakened immune system. It is not widely considered to be fatal, but fatalities have occurred. Bacillus globigii was in fact an altered strain of Bacillus atrophaeus, and many more strain variations exist. The scientists at Fort Detrick experimented with it so extensively that the vast majority of the strains in lab circulation today stem from Fort Detrick in the 1950s. During the 50s and 60s, it was sprayed over large swathes of America, Washington, New York, the New Jersey Turnpike, San Francisco, and so on. In May of 1965, it was covertly released in Washington's National Airport and its corresponding bus terminal. More than 130 passengers were exposed to the bacteria, who subsequently traveled to 39 cities across 7 states. The true level of exposure was subsequently impossible to determine completely. And on the 6th of June, 1966, perhaps the most appalling and direct experiment took place along the 7th and 8th Avenue lines of the New York subway. A group of US Army scientists descended on the underground transport network at various different locations. As had become the norm during these experiments, the men were not accosted by concerned citizens or elements of law enforcement. One scientist was stopped and questioned as he entered the subway station smoking a cigarette. When challenged, he claimed to be from out of state and produced a bogus document suggesting he was conducting work for an industrial research organization. This was a cover that had been presented to the scientists in the unlikely event of them being apprehended, and allowed the scientists to continue on with the experiment unimpeded. The scientists had chosen peak commuting hours to enter the subway stations, with the understanding that this would maximize the efficacy of exposure. The scientists then proceeded to smash and deploy the light bulbs they were equipped with at various different locations throughout the subway. Each light bulb contained many trillions of bacteria, so much so that they left partially visible clouds when broken. They found the most effective route of dispersal was to drop the light bulb from a train window as the train pulled into a station, shattering it on the ground outside. The resulting draft of air when the train pulled away from the platform significantly aided the germ spreading. The report even details public reaction to these events, stating that as these clouds of bacteria engulfed people, they would simply brush at their clothing, look up at the ventilation grate above, and then continue walking. Not one person showed any sign of distress or even care as to what they were walking through. Army scientists would conclude that it took between 4 and 13 minutes for train passengers to be exposed to the bacteria. According to their report, just 5 minutes after deploying the bacteria at the 23rd Street station, it could be detected at every station between 14th Street and 59th. Over the next 4 days, they estimated that more than 1 million people had been exposed. Beyond that, the numbers are impossible to measure. While the army suggested they had conducted the trial to measure the vulnerabilities of the subway to biological attack, the report also stresses that this could be used as an offensive measure and cites multiple foreign entities that have large underground transport systems, such as the Soviet Union, Europe, and South America. And as we'll look at in future videos, this was neither the beginning nor the end for America's designs on germ warfare.